What if Joe McNamara is looking in completely the wrong direction? After everything that happens in Lioness Season 3, Episode 2, it is easy to believe that Russia is the enemy. Russian operatives attack Joe inside her own home. They know enough about her movements to find the right moment. They know she is important. They know she has a tracker. And when the CIA starts putting the pieces together, Joe immediately points toward the Ukrainian operative who helped them capture Alexei Yurimov.
He's moved to the front. I have his location.
But there is a much more disturbing possibility hiding underneath all of this. What if Russia did not discover Joe on its own? What if someone inside the American intelligence system gave them exactly what they needed? Because the more you examine the attack, the stranger it becomes. Joe is not some random CIA employee who can simply be found through public records. She is a senior case officer operating inside one of the most secretive organizations in the world. Yet suddenly, foreign operatives know where she lives, know her routine, know enough about her movements to strike her at home, and seem to understand exactly how the CIA will react. That is not just an attack on Joe, that looks like someone understands the system protecting her. The first thing we have to remember is that Joe's attackers were not amateurs. They watched her. Joe realizes that almost immediately when she reconstructs what happened. The men who came to her house pretended to be state police, but they were improvising because their original plan had already changed. Joe had been in the living room when they expected her to be upstairs. That detail matters because it tells us that these people had been studying her routine. They weren't simply knocking on a random door hoping the right person would answer. They had information. They knew where Joe lived, they knew what she looked like, and they had some understanding of when she would normally be vulnerable. Then, after the first attack fails, Joe's team discovers additional people positioned around the neighborhood. There is a rooftop spotter. There is a cover partner. There is a getaway driver. This is not one angry foreign operative making a reckless move. It is a coordinated operation. And that raises the question the episode wants us to ask. Where did all that intelligence come from? Because knowing Joe's address is one thing. Knowing Joe's schedule is another. Knowing enough about her to understand how valuable she is something else entirely. And this is where the possibility of an insider becomes much more interesting than the simple explanation that Russia found her. The Russians obviously have intelligence capabilities. Nobody watching Lioness would question that. But Joe's attack happens immediately after the Ukrainian operation in Donetsk. And that timing is almost too perfect. Joe and her team capture Yurimov, return to the United States, and shortly afterward, Joe is targeted inside her own home. Byron Westfield assumes the connection is obvious. Joe was exposed in Ukraine, Russia identified her, and this is retaliation. But Joe herself sees something different. She points out that the Russians had opportunities to identify and attack her while she was in the field. They didn't. Instead, the attack comes after a Ukrainian double agent conveniently gives the CIA information, leading them directly to Yurimov. That is where the story stops looking like a simple Russian retaliation and starts looking like a setup. And Joe's suspicion about Yurimov may be the biggest clue of all. She does not simply ask whether the Ukrainian operative betrayed them. She questions whether the man they captured is even Yurimov. Think about how dangerous that possibility is. If the CIA was handed a fake Yurimov, then the entire Ukrainian operation could have been designed to create a false sense of victory. The CIA believes it has captured an important Russian figure. Russia appears to retaliate. Joe becomes exposed. Everyone starts searching for the person who betrayed them. But what if the real objective was never Yurimov? What if Yurimov was simply the piece placed on the board to move Joe exactly where someone wanted her?
What are you going to do about it? Alexei Yurimov.
That would mean the Ukrainian operative did not necessarily need to be working for Russia in the traditional sense. She could have been part of a much larger deception. And if somebody inside the CIA helped make that deception believable, then the agency could already be compromised without realizing it. This is where the theory becomes much darker. The enemy does not need access to every secret inside the CIA. They only need access to the right secret. One person knowing Joe's location could be enough. One person knowing which operation she participated in could be enough. One person knowing what information the CIA received from the Ukrainian source could be enough. And suddenly the Russians don't need to penetrate the entire American intelligence apparatus. They simply need one person on the inside feeding information outward. That would explain why the attack feels so precise. It would also explain why the response is so chaotic. Because an insider would know that once Joe was attacked, the CIA would immediately start looking outside itself. Russia would become the obvious suspect. The Ukrainian operative would become suspicious. Assets would be deployed. Interrogations would begin, and the agency would spend its energy looking for an external enemy, while the real source of the information remained hidden inside the building. Look at what happens next. Jo raises her suspicion about the Ukrainian operative, and almost immediately, Cruz and Kyle are sent to take her. That reaction is important, because it shows just how much power Jo's instincts have inside the organization. She does not need to prove everything before the machinery starts moving. Her suspicion is enough to trigger another covert operation. Now imagine the perspective of someone who is secretly manipulating this entire situation. They don't need to tell the CIA what to do. They simply need to give Jo a believable reason to suspect someone. Jo does the rest herself. That is what makes this theory so dangerous. What if the traitor isn't controlling Jo? What if they're controlling the information Jo receives? Because Jo is exactly the kind of person who will follow a suspicious lead until she finds the truth. If someone can manufacture that lead, they can effectively steer her without ever touching her, and that could be why the Ukrainian operative is so important. Maybe she really is guilty. Maybe she betrayed the CIA. But even if she did, that still doesn't answer the bigger question. Who gave her the opportunity? Who approved the operation? Who verified the intelligence? Who decided Yurimov was the correct target? Who knew Jo was involved? And who understood enough about the Lioness program to predict what would happen after the capture? These are the questions the season should be pushing us toward. Because if Alexandra is simply the traitor, then the mystery is relatively straightforward. But if Alexandra is only one piece of the puzzle, then the real conspiracy could reach much deeper. There is another detail that makes the timeline even more suspicious: the 6-month gap. The show keeps jumping between the first attack on Jo's home and the later kidnapping where Russian men have already captured her. That means we are not watching the whole story unfold in chronological order. We are watching pieces of a story whose middle is still missing. We know Jo survives the first attack. We know she eventually moves her family to Camp Peary. We know she is eventually kidnapped from her car. And we know that whoever captures her already understands that she has a tracker hidden in her body. So something happens during those 6 months. Something changes. The enemy learns more. Jo's security changes. The investigation develops. And somewhere inside that missing period could be the moment when Jo's suspicions become reality. Maybe that is why the later kidnapping is so brutal. The Russians already know what they are looking for. They don't simply want Jo dead. They want the tracker removed. They know she has one, and they are willing to torture her to find it. But how did they know about it? Jo herself tells them the CIA does not implant tracking devices in its operatives, which means the Russians may have received inaccurate information, or they may know something Jo doesn't. Either way, the fact that they are looking specifically for a tracker suggests that someone has been feeding them intelligence about CIA procedures. And once again, that takes us back inside the agency. How much does the enemy actually know about Jo, and who taught them? Then there is Jo's family. This may be the most important pressure point of the entire season. Jo can survive being hunted. She can survive interrogation. She can survive getting shot, kidnapped, or thrown into another impossible mission. But her family changes the equation. The first attack happens at her home, not on a battlefield. Her daughters witness the aftermath. Her husband watches her collapse emotionally. And by the end of the episode, Jo is no longer simply a professional operative dealing with an international crisis. She is a mother who now understands that the war has followed her home. That gives whoever is behind this operation an enormous advantage. They don't have to defeat Jo physically. They can threaten the people she cannot afford to lose. And that makes the final scene with Josie especially interesting. Josie is watching over Jo's daughters, and one of them asks whether she knows karate. Josie simply reveals that she has a gun. On the surface, it is just a cool little moment. But in the context of this season, it feels like something more. Jo's world is already bleeding into the next generation. Her children are learning what kind of life their mother lives. Josie is becoming part of their protection. Cruz is being pulled deeper into another operation. And the CIA is once again turning human beings into pieces on a much larger board. The question is whether Jo can protect her family without becoming even more trapped inside that machine. But here is where I think the season could deliver its biggest twist. Jo may eventually discover that the person who betrayed her was not some obvious villain hiding in Russia. It may be someone she trusted inside the system. And if that happens, everything we've seen in episode 2 suddenly changes meaning. The Ukrainian source isn't just suspicious. Yermov isn't just questionable. The attack on Joe's home isn't just retaliation. The kidnapping isn't just revenge. They become stages of the same operation. Someone gives the CIA Yermov. Someone allows Joe's identity to become exposed. Someone helps the Russians locate her. Then, when Joe begins investigating, another suspicious person is placed directly in front of her. Joe follows the trail exactly as expected. And while she is looking outward, the person responsible remains protected by the very organization Joe is fighting to defend. That is the terrifying possibility hanging over Season 3. Joe isn't simply fighting an enemy that wants her dead. She may be fighting an enemy that understands exactly how she thinks, and that is much harder to defeat. Because Joe's instincts have always been her greatest weapon. If someone can manipulate the information feeding those instincts, then even Joe's best decisions can become part of the enemy's plan. So when Cruz and Kyle take Alexandra away for questioning, I don't think we should simply ask whether she betrayed the CIA. We should ask whether someone wanted Joe to believe she did. Because if the real enemy is inside the CIA, then the investigation has already been compromised. The person pulling the strings doesn't need to stop Joe from finding the truth. They just need to make sure she finds the wrong truth first. And if that's what Lioness Season 3 is building toward, then Joe's biggest battle may not be against Russia at all. It may be against the person standing beside her when she finally realizes the truth.